So welcome everybody, and it's great to see such a turnout, I think, for this evening. I think it reflects how people love to be with Paul, how they enjoy his company, and how they're looking forward to, I hope, to an entertaining evening. And I want to start with this question. And it's a question that's really important, because in 1989 I turned up in Papua New Guinea as a young clinician, starting my first episode of research. And within 3 or 4 months of appearing there, I kept on hearing about this bloke, Paul Garner. Yeah, and these were my words. Who is Paul Garner? And effectively, he was really clearly somebody that had a big impact on people. No one could forget Paul, and so obviously, as a UK medic, I must know the other UK medic that was such a big character sitting out there. And dubious taste, facial hair, and this kind of varied up and down according to the time. And we never actually met when I was in Papua New Guinea, but certainly his reputation preceded me and him. This, in fact, is his first attempt at British military fitness. And we'll come back to that, I'm sure. But typical, Paul trying to carry a bilum, which is these net bags that Papua New Guinean women use to carry everything on his back. And it wasn't really until 10 or 11 years later that I turned up at LSTM, and then was surprised and actually fascinated to meet this bloke about which I'd heard so much. Mostly, it must be said, well, not all derogatory. It's not clear exactly what he did do in Papua New Guinea apart from smoke Highland gold, but it was clearly he was somebody that made a big impression on people then, and I think he's continued to do that throughout his life. He was very kind to me when I first arrived. He excuse me, he kind of helped me settle in. He was clearly somebody larger than life, somebody that really was supportive in everyone around him. And it became very clear that we bonded a little bit over a love of sport and his cycling that he did, his running, and of course his British military fitness, about which, quite frankly, could bore you to tears. And I think many of us in the room will recognise his enthusiasm for such activities. It also, though, became very clear soon that he loved controversy. If there's any chance of getting on the television talking about something really exciting and controversial, it's Paul's bit. And in many ways, as a Cochrane editor, I think there is an element of the journalist, the love of a scoop, the love of actually getting out there and essentially challenging the status quo. And that became very clear that it was something that he wanted to do and loved doing. But I think behind that, and we'll talk, I'm sure Paul will talk a little bit more about some of those controversies that he was involved in. This work that he did on COVID, that I think many people will have seen in the room, was really very important, I think, in starting the dialogue around long COVID. And his journey of thinking that you can see in those articles, I think mirrored many other people's journeys, and was really quite influential in getting that discussion, that topic, important topic, on to the agenda, and then starting to really dissect out what we meant by long COVID. There are many other examples of his love for controversy, and we'll talk about vaccines, and we'll talk about all sorts of issues. As a director, one has a slightly different perspective when the press officer rings you up and says, "It's Paul again," and you wonder where we're going. But at the heart of this is his desire to get to the truth, the desire to actually make clinical decisions on real world evidence, to move. And he has been scathing about what medicine was like 20, 25 years ago, when the whole idea of actually using evidence rather than expertise from these grey-beard old men usually was really anathema. And what he's done throughout his work, I think, with the Cochrane Infectious Diseases Group, has really demonstrated the value of evidence. My strongest personal experience of that with Paul is when the work on mefloquine, and when I was chairing the UK Malaria Committee. As you know, mefloquine has had a controversial, I think, history in terms of its benefit versus its harm, and with some very, very strong advocates of its harm, some very unethical advocates sometimes. the evidence that he was able to put through the Cochrane review process and continue to refine over the years was absolutely instrumental in helping that particular committee, but many other committees like that one, make decisions and actually improve the quality of healthcare. And I think that's really what it's all about. In many ways, the achievements of the Cochrane group here have been phenomenal. The move from tropical medicine to infectious diseases, the quality of the outputs that we have seen, which is far exceeds many other Cochrane groups, are amazing. And certainly for LSTM, to have a group that really focused on evidence, and also Paul's and others working in persuading DFID, now FCDO, other funders, other implementers of the value of evidence in this environment was really, really key. It's been a critical part of what LSTM has done, clearly both in terms of the money it's brought in, but more importantly, in the impact that it's had for what we can do. And I think Paul should be congratulated for taking essentially what was a nascent, very much a nascent idea at some point and turning it into something that is recognised worldwide and certainly has been of huge value to nationally. It's difficult to talk about Paul without talking about Paul and his women. Now, unfortunately, I've not got all evening because that could be a very long, very long talk. But three in particular, I think, have to be acknowledged for the work and quite frankly for putting up with Paul for however many years it is. But without these three, Paula, Phil, Christiane, the achievements of the unit and what Paul's achieved would just not have occurred. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that, and that we end basically on thanking you as well for putting up with Paul, for supporting him in what we're about to hear about later on, and good luck with the new boss. I'm going to stop there and hand over directly to George. So I hand over to George and Paul. Thank you very much for what you've done, and we'll have a good celebration later.
That's mine, yeah. So I'm, oh, is that going to work? Brilliant. So it's a great pleasure to be here to say a few words about Paul at the introduction of this valedictory lecture. So traditionally, universities have inaugural and valedictory lectures. This is Groningen, so this is their list. You have some inaugural lectures and you have valedictory lectures. The inaugural lecture is when you arrive, and the valedictory lecture is when you leave. Paul and I met at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I was lucky enough to work for Geoffrey Rose, one of the greatest epidemiologists of the 20th century. Geoffrey, when we were there, I think 1991, I think it was, Geoffrey gave a valedictory lecture, and he turned up and he said, I actually never gave an inaugural lecture. So this is simultaneously my valedictory and inaugural lecture. And I'd only ever known one person who did that. But then I heard that Paul had never given an inaugural lecture at Liverpool School. So I'm really pleased to be at Paul's joint inaugural and valedictory lecture. As I say, we met at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And it was a quite interesting time for the school. It had its first neoliberal director, who was aiming to introduce Thatcherite policies on the school. And Paul and I and others talked about this. And one day I saw this editorial in the Lancet. In those days, the Lancet was worth reading. I used to read the Lancet. Not anonymous editorial about are academic institutions corrupt? And this I thought, God, this sounds a bit familiar. Good research thrives on new ideas and approaches and usually requires researchers to work together. Moreover, a functional team is more productive than its component parts because people share their collective experience and knowledge. Good research also needs direction from leaders who draw on their vision, experience and political adroitness while encouraging the contributions of junior colleagues by supporting their enthusiasm and self-development. And I said, hey, Paul, have you seen this? Did you see that great editorial? And he said, yes, I wrote it. Because, of course, Lance editorials were anonymous in those days. And then, of course, he finished. In practice, however, medical research is often a much grubbier world. And I think we can say that Paul has gone to help expose, not obviously not contribute to, but to expose, that much grubbier world. Both of us were not at the school for a huge amount of time. One of the bright ideas for the new director was to change its name to the European School of Public Health. That didn't seem such a great idea. It's like the New England Journal of Medicine changing its name to the Intergalactic Journal of Medicine, as though somehow just by calling yourself something grander, you became something grander. Of course, it's lucky they didn't change that name, because they would now have to be the United Kingdom School of Public Health. And given that our neighbours are probably more astute than we are, quite soon to the English School of Public Health. That proposal led to a campaign not to get the name changed, and the name wasn't changed. But Paul, myself, and Thierry Mertens were in an escape committee, of which I was the first person to escape, and I went up to Glasgow, and then Paul came to Liverpool. And we had, I think Paul came up to Glasgow, I was there. We still saw each other sometimes down in London. But then the next sort of sustained contact with Paul was when Shah Ibrahim and I, in 2000, took over the International Journal of Epidemiology. This started what was probably the most exciting 16 years of my career, most interesting 16 years, which was running that journal with Shah and a fantastic group of co-editors. When we took it over, from someone who people in Liverpool will know, the late Peter Farrow, who sadly died at the end of last year, but who for many years was a professor in Liverpool. And Peter said to us, well, one of the problems you really get is infectious disease. I can never get any reviewers for infectious disease, so you should keep on one of the old editorial board, Philip Brackman, the great Philip Brackman from the US. And he will deal with manuscripts for $11. So we used to call it, Philip was known as the $11 man. And Shah and I worked out that we could send, we only got 400 papers a year to begin with. We could just send them all over to Philip and make about 25 grand a year profit. But instead we went and got some other infectious disease editors, one of whom was Paul, and the submissions over the period went up to about 2,000 by the last year Shah and I were doing it. But the problem was Shah and I didn't do due diligence. I mean, if you're going to appoint people as, on your editorial board, you should look back at their history. And of course, if we had, we would have come across this about that Paul was a troublemaker. Here we have schoolboys slam youth club. Vicar hits back. Yep. Yeah, Paul had complained that the kids from the secondary modern school weren't being allowed into the posh youth club, and was expelled from the youth club. As I say, Shah and I should have learned from this lesson. And Paul was, of course, born to be wild, as you can see from this photograph. And I can honestly say that Paul did create us probably more trouble and controversy while we ran Shah and I actively tried to create trouble and controversy. For example, translating a paper from a study that was carried out in Germany in 1942, demonstrating that smoking caused lung cancer in a properly done case control study with a negative control, which is an advance. It was a methodological advance. But yeah, Paul has definitely created most trouble for us. One of these, I think Paul will mention these. So I'm not going to go into any detail in these, but one of these was on publicising some animal studies that were done using a vaccine, which threw up worrying findings that Paul, I think, will talk about. That one led to a phone call that one of us got from Oxford, suggesting to us you'd probably be wiser not to publish this paper if you were wise. But we did go ahead and publish it. But that was a threatening phone call. That's pretty good, really, for an editor. And then the second source of controversy was the debate on deworming programs, and Paul's campaign to get a very large trial carried out in India actually published and to contribute to the literature, demonstrating that the study which was used to provide much of the evidence, there were problems with that, and Paul commissioned a series of papers on this for us, including a couple of reanalyses of the aforementioned controversial study. I mean, I think with Shah and I, this was pushing at an open door, because when I started hearing about Gates and Sachs and everyone pushing deworming, it just took me back to what was one of the sort of foundational historical stories that we were told, and when thinking about the politics of public health, which was the Rockefellers' support of deworming campaigns in the South and in Mexico, but in the south of the US and in Mexico, and that you could just treat the germ of laziness and you would get a productive workforce. In fact, it was sort of history of public health, politics of public health 101. And these papers are all worth reading. My favorite is from the late great Steve Kunitz, contrasting campaigns and research on hookworm, which was entirely individualizing, and pellagra, which looked at diet in communities with Goldberger. And in Steve's paper, he says some of this still resonates with some forms of global public health. First, the eradication campaign had many of the characteristics of a religious crusade. Second, in accordance with its religious hue, the campaign was designed to rid the patient sinner of his or her individual disease sin, bypassing politics, society, economics, and culture. Third, the Commission believed that inefficient workers whose productivity was thought to have been reduced by disease could be made more productive simply by ridding them of the parasite, thus contributing to the economic and industrial development of the region and the nation, and to the betterment of the workers themselves. And fourth, the Commission believed that the factory system made it possible to improve the lives of people mired previously in medieval squalor. Of course, the deworming campaign, the deworming research had moved on to look at children, but there's also in adults and in those groups. And this is one of Paul's contributions to the debate around that issue. And David Taylor Robinson, I don't know if he's here today, but was involved in systematic reviews with Paul of this field. So I thought I should finish by finding Paul's latest paper. So I've been watching them pop up, but I think this is the latest one formally published, 29th of August. Have you had one since? So and I love this because it's classic of the work that Paul does collaboratively with people, and it's David mentioned that the ivermectin systematic review, and it's introducing this notion that you should have ways of looking at the sort of research integrity of studies, get a score for that, because we know that in the ivermectin field, some of these studies were just straightforwardly fraudulent. It's sort of a likelihood of fraud index. I can't see this becoming controversial in any way, but I think it'll be interesting to see how this tool develops. So we all know what it means. Farewells are sad occasions, but we've also seen many farewell tours that weren't real farewells. So I'd like now to introduce Paul Garner's first valedictory lecture. Thank you.
George and David were talking about collaboration, and so often in research, it's about people competing with each other and not working together. And so the editorial in the Lancet that I wrote many years ago is what I truly believe, and that's what I followed in my life. And okay. So I've got it now. We've got the technology here. So the work that really we've been doing in Liverpool since I arrived here in '94 has been around systematic reviews and synthesizing evidence. We've been supported by the UK aid programme, mainly the UK aid programme, very extensively. They've been great funders and great support to us, and I thank them for that. I would also like to say that the money that UK aid has provided support for has been not just for us in Liverpool, but a whole network of people. We've been working, Phil and Christiane and Paula and others have been working with people in South Africa and in Kenya and in Nigeria and Africa and China, and developed a huge network of people with expertise in systematic reviews. And they're all great leaders, and it's been an honor to work with them. This talk is not about them. That is their triumphs. And so I'm going to move on from that and talk about the team here. So this work all started with in Papua New Guinea when I was a medical officer out there in the bush, and I was trying to start pregnant women on chemoprophylaxis for pregnancy, which was WHO's standard treatment at the time. And so we got all the women taking chloroquine in one village, and then suddenly we heard that they had stopped. So I went out to the village to give them health education, to tell them that they needed to start taking the chloroquine. And you know, health education is basically doctors telling other people what they should do. And so I got talking to Mrs. Yakula from the village there. And so she said, well, why should I take chloroquine? I'm not sick. It tastes horrible. I couldn't really work out what to say to her. So I said, well, I think it makes your babies live longer. I think, and she said, well, how does it do that? I said, well, makes them bigger. And of course, she thought I was completely mad because their greatest fear was going into obstructed labour and in childbirth. And she said to me, "Medicine by bugger up and be straight or no gut." This is based on the Australian language, Rebecca. Will this medicine bugger me up or not? Will this do me more harm than good? And it's really a very good question, and it refers to the paper that we talked about, that Ian has talked about. So that sort of rattled around my head, that question, for a long time. And I, as I walked around, and perhaps when I left New Guinea, I asked an expert about this. They said, oh yeah, there's no evidence that prophylaxis works, which, well, so I thought she's right. But then I asked somebody else and they said it's unethical not to give prophylaxis. So then I went to WHO that should know about all of this stuff, and they said opinions on this matter vary. So there you had some sort of equipoise and viewpoints on this. So I didn't really know what to do. And then I met Ian Chalmers at Oxford, and he said the only way to answer her question is to conduct a systematic review of all relevant randomized controlled trials. I had no idea what he meant. At that time, systematic reviews weren't in our parlance. But the other attractive thing about Ian was he'd been described as the leader of an obstetrical Bieder-Meinhof gang. Now, for people that are a bit younger, that is a terrorist organization at the time. And so, of course, you know, for somebody as impressionable as me at that time, this was obviously very exciting to consider. And so we through, and actually, my line manager at the time was Trudy Harpen, who actually I've known since the age of 4. She came to, I mean, it's extraordinary. She came to my 4th birthday party. These are pictures of Trudy in cowboy gear, right? So she was my line manager. What an extraordinary coincidence in international health. And she said, develop a specialist area. So here it was in front of me. And that's what I moved to Liverpool with. The underlying theory is that so much research has been published. No one knows which to use and how to use it. Expert opinion is normally the way at the time of summarizing it. And that's unreliable, but you need scientifically defensible, systematic reviews that critically appraise and summarize all relevant research. And that was the big idea. And it was also combined with this new organization called Cochrane, which was made a lot of sense, but had principles in it like collaboration rather than competition, build on the enthusiasm of individuals, avoid duplicating things, keeping up to date, minimizing bias. And the other thing about it was publishing electronically. And at the time, this wasn't really, it's now an everyday thing, but at the time, this was very, very unusual. So we set up it's not, the slides are not fitting. So anyway, so we set up a team, we had some money, we set up a team here, Phil. There's a team of people, and this team aimed to support other people in doing reviews. So we set up the Cochrane Infectious Diseases group, and we would perhaps do some of the reviews, but the aim was to support others. And Reevy Robb is there in the middle, a very experienced managing editor that worked with us. So the first thing we did was go to demonstrate the method. And the first thing we did was to get Christian Lengler, who was involved, he had a fellowship, to do a meta-analysis of impregnated mosquito nets for controlling malaria. And there were a series of randomized controlled trials in the pipeline and being done. A lot of excitement about it. Needed lots of investment if this was to go forward. And so this review that he did, this is the 2004 main results, was that it reduced child mortality by 17%, and that was very high certainty of evidence, very clear effect. So this review had, when we first did it, as I was saying to Paula Williamson, we didn't have the methods for doing meta-analyzing cluster randomized trials. So we didn't have any we didn't have any confidence intervals in the first edition, but the 2004 edition, we developed the methods. And that was part of Cochrane, was about developing methods and things as we went along. And this review has had a substantive, the impact on mortality underpinned the investment, highly cited. Since that time, 2004, 2 billion mosquito nets have been delivered worldwide. So this review and the research behind the review, obviously the researchers did the research in the first place, underpinned it. We did another review on amidiaquine for treating malaria. Chloroquine was failing. Amidiaquine was being used in francophone countries. When you look at the, bring together all these small studies, none of which would demonstrate an effect by themselves or be convincing, there was a very convincing higher cure rates with amidiaquine. But the strange thing about this, the radical thing about this, was 17 of these studies were never published, had never been published, and 20 were in French, right? So nobody would have thought of using French literature in a review before. But, you know, it was Francophone Africa that was using amidiaquine. So this led to it being reintroduced. And the oral rehydration salt solution. So there were 4 really big reviews. There were some questions about whether oral rehydration salt solution was too salty. People were doing trials in it, didn't know which was, the effects were quite modest in the trials. And we worked with WHO and well, Siochin did, and these are the review team after they'd finished the review. And the review overall showed that the new solution, the less salty solution, led to better health outcomes. There was few drips were put up and recovery was quicker. And this review was considered by WHO and UNICEF urgently, changed policy within 6 months before the paper was even published, and it was retooled. So the ORS formulas were, the factories just were retooled to have this. So this was fantastic impact and helped us, as David says, negotiate with the funder that this work was worth doing. These were good demonstration products. And Martin had joked this huge group effort with about 60 or 70 researchers pooling data, are looking at whether adding artemisinin to chloroquine, amidiaquine, SP or mafequine, adding this starting combination treatment for malaria showed clearly that this was increased cure rates by about 30 or 40%. It was very dramatic. And indeed, so this was all within about a period of a year. So that review, up to that point, WHO guidelines in malaria were expert opinion, sometimes with reference to this, but not always. And so over that period, there was a big change within the organization. And this was one of the few first WHO guidelines that came through the block of these artemisinin combination treatments. Here was the summary of the RCTs, and the basis for the decision was systematic reviews. So to replace monotherapy with oral ACTs given for 3 days. So in 10 years, we'd arrived. And so that was really, really helpful. And it was good in some ways, but in other ways, there were other areas. It was good because what we were looking at sort of coincided what the policy and researchers were looking at. The problem came when we started doing reviews and they clashed with what policy was saying. And then this became much more difficult. So for example, the WHO announced, and Ian will remember this, you sent me a fax of the press release, that directly observed therapy, where people swallow treatment in front of a health worker, was actually the greatest invention since the discovery of penicillin, according to the Director General of WHO. And they were launching a campaign, a fundraising campaign with this package of care labeled directly observed therapy, but it was really quite confusing. At this time, the Cochrane author from South Africa, who became Vice Chancellor of Research in Stellenbosch University, Jimmy Deworming, noted that directly observed therapy was conspicuous in its absence amongst the trials we reviewed, and that we needed independent effects were awaited before this was wholesale. This caused absolute confusion and debate, and we were attacked. So actually, Jimmy was pulled into somebody's office in WHO when he was visiting there, and this person said to him, "It is because of people like you that we can't get people in developing countries to do what we tell them." I mean, what else do you say? I mean, it's sort of etched in Jimmy's brain, this British person said this. And you know, it was over 5 years, trials were done, and the trials basically, and then they were incorporated in the reviews that, as Ian set this up, that we updated over time. And this really, in terms of cure, the trials that randomize people to direct observation versus self-treatment, there really isn't much difference between them. It's certainly not as important as penicillin. And you know, it caused WHO a bit of a problem because they labeled this program. There was a load of stuff behind it, but about purchasing drugs and regimes under this label, but the label was confusing people. So I understand, and this is more sort of the evidence base for this. So they were sitting around in WHO saying, DOTS, we've got this program called DOTS, Directly Observed Therapy Short Course. What are we gonna, you know, Garner and, you know, Deworming, they keep banging on about this and it's causing us a bit of a trouble. How are we gonna rebrand? So one of them said, well, why don't we turn the T upside down, turn it upside down, and we got Stop TB. So they rebranded it as Stop TB. I don't have that recorded, that or anything, but it's a good story anyway, isn't it? So that's the program now. It's no DOTS no longer. It's Stop TB. So thank goodness, and we've it's been incorporated. So that battle is over. But often, you know, these competing interests everybody thinks that it's industry that is the problem. You know, everybody says, oh, it must be the drug companies, but actually researchers, universities, UN organizations, and now I can say patient activist groups spin and misrepresent research findings. And I'm not, and you know, this sort of money, power, ideology, people lock into something. George was talking about it with deworming. Then a group of people form around this as a social identity to maintain these beliefs. And then they bully, exclude, and manipulate people to triumph trumps truth, because that's what they want to win. They don't want what the truth is. And that's why collaboration is so important. This us and them is very unhelpful. And the title of the talk comes from Vegard Weiler, who's a friend and colleague in Norway, saying it is only the truth that can benefit patients. He works in chronic fatigue in adolescents in Norway. I like it a lot. So the other phrase I've always used is skepticemia, which any mass DTMH student will, I hope, have had drilled into them, that skepticemia is a uncommon generalized disorder of low infectivity, and medical school is likely to confer lifelong immunity. And this is Peter Skrabanek, who is a lovely phrase. And, you know, so we talked about routine deworming in children. This looked like an interesting topic. I worked in Papua New Guinea. In Papua New Guinea, lots of children had light worm loads, but it didn't seem to be a big consequence to them. And we did with Paula Williamson, who's with us today. We did a systematic review fairly early on that was published both in the BMJ and in Cochrane in 2000, and basically saying the evidence isn't as strong. There is some evidence, but it's not as strong as people in the field seem to be making out. And then what happened was there was a letter in response with only about it was only about 200 words. There was hardly anything in the response. There was more column inches on the people signing the letter saying we object to this review. And look at them all. They're all big noises in WHO, CDC. Interestingly, only one person from a low-income country had signed up to this letter. So you get a nose for these things. Something is going on here. So and then I found out that there was this industry behind this called Deworm the World. I mean, there's a group in America that wants to deworm the world. And you know, it went to the highest. They're working much higher up the food chain than we were ever would. Sherry Blair wants to kill the world's intestinal worm. So this is from the Time magazine, and this is at Davos. And Sherry Blair is pretending to be an intestinal worm while wearing boots with 3-inch heels after a bunch of Davos attendees pretended to be school children. Jean Sperling, an economic advisor, is pretending to be a teacher to get the anti-worm medicine to the kids. So these people, you know, they don't need epidemiologists and medics. They're going straight through to the policymakers. WHO had a document that said deworming eradicates extreme poverty and hunger, achieves universal health education, promotes gender equity and empowers women. And this very leaflet says Japan's rise to economic power, it could be well accounted for by deworming. This is the WHO. So this is sort of Ian's detector was on at this point. You know, and the Nobel Prize winners sit around on their backside saying, how do we spend $75 billion if they add it, deworming? And this was based on this one trial. But, you know, the Cochrane review has changed over time, and David has been a solid first author on this for many years. It's been a fascinating experience. Had 44 trials in it, 67,000 participants and another 1 million in the current review. And the conclusion of the authors is it is probably misleading to justify contemporary deworming programs based on the evidence. Yet millions and millions was being raised for these programs. And you know, why this is in David was that the real sparks started flying when we used a new set of methods called grade, and that gave us a certainty around little or no effect, and that was very important. So then, you know, Cochrane's it went a bit mad. Cochrane's incomplete and misleading summary. So I'd like you to look at the word incomplete. So we were accused of being incomplete. However, our review included this trial. So this trial was a good randomized trial from Vietnam, and the author of this trial phoned me up and said, Paul, I know you Cochrane people like unpublished studies. I've got one on my desk. We did it in Vietnam. It's a very nice study, but it doesn't show an effect. But I've been told not to publish it, and there are other people on the team who are very powerful. And you know, so I said, well, let me have it, and we'll negotiate. So we negotiated it, and it was included in the review, but it was unpublished, and the team were holding it as unpublished because it didn't show an effect. There's another trial of biggest drug trial ever done of 1 million children with very important, all very prestigious authors working with Shalley and others, that was completed in 2006 and still unpublished in 2013. And George even offered to the team to use a whole journal of the IGE to publish this if they said the data was so complicated. But it was being kept in the background because it didn't show an effect, and we eventually got it published. I'm not. The persuasion was. I can explain to how we managed that over wine perhaps later. But it was recognised that we got this then in the public domain, and we really had about 5 years to campaigning for this. But we also found that some of the trials were tweaked, and David and I were sitting in my office looking at the Uganda trial saying, oh my God, have they actually corrected for clustering, you know, a classical error? And they said they had, and we appreciated that suddenly we realized they hadn't adjusted for clustering, which made the effects look more important than they were. And once they adjusted, effects demonstrated in the confidence intervals kind of vanished. And we wrote to the authors, guy at the World Bank, he said, did you correct for clustering on your primary outcome in the paper you published? Oh, well spotted, he said. Well, oh, I missed that. Must have been something in the coding. So other stuff was going on. This study was reanalyzed by the London School very well. And George has talked about this other study, which I had very clever researcher, very fastidious researcher, Sophie Julian, who unpicked these incredibly complicated studies of long-term impact, because people were claiming deworming improved child health, improved nutrition, improved economic productivity of whole populations, and led to economic development. That's what the argument was, and that's why that's why they were raising money. That's why they were paralyzing the whole of the India health system to deworm the whole country at one stage. So, and we submitted this for publication, and the papers that and it went out to referee George, and then the papers that we based it on were all online, and then when we got it back, they'd all vanished. The people just took offline, just vanished. So the debate, this kicked off a debate. We were trending on Twitter at one stage. Worm Wars was trending on Twitter, and David was on more or less on the radio, but things started seeping out. So people said, well, the Cochrane review is understandable, but it just feels wrong. You know, and then, you know, it works in animals, so after all, we are all animals, you know. And then I started getting attacked. Deworming horses, Lorenzo Savioli, who used to be the head of neglected tropical diseases at WHO, deworming horses is a straightforward, understandable issue. Why is it so controversial for our species? Stop Cochrane. He's got these two donkeys, you see, on his farm in Pemba. And I mean, you know, this one is not dewormed, and this one is. So I was actually given that right here by him saying, you know, well, I present 60,000 meta-analyses. He said, but what about my donkeys? I said, how do I go to Africa and my friends and say it's on the basis of your donkeys that we should be doing this? And then, you know, the Cochrane group is a systematic review of RCT Talibans, a small group of fundamentalists, but quite aggressive, with their rocket-propelled SR grenades on their shoulders and apparently nothing better to do. So Taliban, fair enough, but I was sent off to Lake Malawi with no access to praziquantel forever. So what I'm getting at, there's this sort of bullying and rather sort of uncomfortable from senior figures, you know. And, you know, a senior academic came to me just after I put in promotion for a professor and said, you know, some of your work, and you're talking to the BMJ about the lack of effectiveness of deworming, it's going to interfere with our grants that we're trying to get at the moment. I really think you ought to step back. So this person has now left, but it wouldn't happen under the current regime. But this stuff goes on. The last thing was David and I were asked to present to a coalition of advocates for this in America. And we said, no, we'll send you a video recording and take questions. So we were sitting in the office as a video recording to the activists, if you like, the people that were promoting, 400 people promoting deworming. And as we were talking, our media officer texted and said, what's going on Twitter? And he said, there's a load of things rubbishing your reviews. And what had happened that day, a journal, PLOS NTD, released 4 papers rubbishing the review and rubbishing us. Here's some of them. Cochrane reviews, methodological bias can lead the Cochrane collaboration to irrelevance. Cochrane reviews on turned the argument to a human rights issue. So what had happened was that, you know, the journal editor and the coalition had got together to diss us, to throw us out the water. We actually found the minutes for the meeting where 60 people attended a conference call to discuss the single item agenda was how do we respond to the Cochrane review. And they retained 2 PR companies. And this is what was happening. So this is I mean, this is us just doing this review, you know. I mean, and you know, and it is difficult to know when to stop doing things. And the vitamin A is a good example. Is routine vitamin A still justified in Nepal? I'm going out next week to talk about this. And vitamin A probably now could be dropped. So when to drop things is quite a difficult decision. So this review has been mentioned already, looked at animal studies for a TB vaccine, and this was really quite controversial. And because we had some reputation for being a bit of an arbiter and standing our ground, somebody had come to us and said, there's been problems in the lab, a challenge for a TB vaccine. The monkeys that with the new vaccine were seen to be dying quicker or hastening their death, their endpoint. But this information had not gone out, and there was a trial on the way to test the vaccine in 3,000 children in South Africa. And these people felt very passionate about this, and we didn't really know what to do. It's very difficult for us. You know, criticizing another university or whatever else. But this is when this review came out, where we pointed out, we looked at all the animal studies, and saying that the largest trial had actually been, publication had been delayed until after the South Africa trial had started recruiting children. And this is a bit unusual, really. And so the data were that the old vaccine, 2 out of the very small numbers, but 2 out of the 6 monkeys with the old, the standard vaccine had developed TB and then were euthanized. But the ones with the additional new vaccine, 5 out of the 6 had developed TB and had to be euthanized. And whilst this isn't, you know, statistically you can't do very much with this, it should be some kind of signal that perhaps the vaccine is not working so well. And Sam knows these figures and has worked on this data quite extensively. So, and you know, as show these results to a person on the street, my dad, for example, if they weren't going to use the results, why did they do the experiment? And I think that that's quite appropriate. So I stepped back at that time. Deborah Cohen, who's a great investigative journalist, took over this, and after about 8 years, a report was published in the British Medical Journal trying to follow through this. And I actually honestly believe that the people in Oxford really thought that they were doing a good thing and they were saving, you know, I think that that you get into these pressure cooker environments where the whole group believes something, but, you know, I think it was really wrong. I mean, my view, it was really wrong to sort of put this data aside. And in fact, the trial was done and didn't show an effect, and the vaccine candidate has been left. So you get this nose for bullshit, and then ivermectin and COVID came along, and that seemed to be full of bullshit, really. And one particular bit was the ivermectin story about whether ivermectin should be used for COVID, and yeah, it was a deja vu moment when you know you've experienced this bullshit before. And one of the studies that was based on had in the ivermectin randomized group 4 people died, and in the control group 30 died. So I mean, you just do not see. It's obvious this is fake. It's obvious you don't see any drug that has that kind of effect, but this took off on social media and some very poor quality reviews, and that's important why reviews should be high quality. And the ivermectin review trials have been done, and the review was done by in Cochrane with a great team of people, and has an altmetric score of 10,000, one of the most highly cited and disseminated reviews ever, and basically says the evidence is from trials doesn't demonstrate an effect. I mean, it's a sort of a bogus argument because we didn't believe in the first place that it would have any effect. But anyway, that helped put it to rest. And as Tom knows, when we talked about the chloroquine review, Tom, we said, well, we know sort of chloroquine isn't going to work in COVID, but there's still a lot of hype that it might, so we can put it to rest by summarizing those trials. And at that time, there were over 100 systematic reviews of chloroquine, all very rather confusing. So using a Cochrane review to put something to rest like this is very important. So those are some of the controversies, but you know, the controversies contrast with some of the very positive experiences that we've had, and where the evidence we've summarized has helped support policies move forward. One of the biggest changes, I think, is attitudes and change. So when I started here in '94 and taught on the DTM&H course, people were actually, when I was talking about systematic reviews, they attacked me and said, this is a threat to our clinical freedom, it's misguided nonsense. I mean, I don't think many people remember how you know, there was sort of Cochrane as a religious I mean, there were all sorts of things rubbishing the organization. So that's how it started out. But the idea is just wonderful. So that in 2014, the DTM&H course here had a great great bake-off. And here, people were making, these are in my kitchen, students were making biscuits with the Cochrane logo on it. Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. Guidelines for the treatment of malaria. You know, we had fights in last century about whether we should use systematic reviews. And in 2015, our reviews underpinned most of the main changes. And, you know, 8 of these reviews were led by LMIC authors and 4 by staff in Liverpool. And the other thing is that there was a great big chunk of the guidelines that summarized the research, the summaries of the reviews. And this is important politically because in the past, WHO and others, I remember chair of the panel saying we shouldn't, we shouldn't put all these statistics in because people don't understand them. That is not true. There's a national capacity. People understand them. They can use these summaries to make their own decisions. They don't need WHO to tell them. And I want to thank David Sinclair, who coordinated this with Anne-Marie Stefani. Where's Anne-Marie? We were working through this. And so another thing, which I think this is probably the achievement I was most proud of with Hannah, of working with people in India to set up a formal guidelines process for extrapulmonary TB. So it was run by government and the additional program, and we provided methodological backup and support. And they used the right methods all the way to do these evidence-based guidelines. It was incredible. I mean, we had 13 groups. We had about 400 researchers at one stage. It was incredible, all working on 30. There was a TB group for the eye and the TB group for the abdomen, and they were all summarizing the literature. But it was a fantastic achievement. And AIMS, the All India Institute in New Delhi, was involved. Here's Hannah, the wonderful researcher that did most of the work, talking with him about these principles. So, and we've trained people all over the place. There's lots of training gone on, young people in Cornell. There's Marty in the background. Well, I can't see where Marty is. People in South Africa we've worked with collectively, in Garner. And the other thing is the learning that goes on in the L17 area. So this is actually slightly different. So the way I used to teach inequity to the L7 to the DTM and H students is say, there's 80 of you. I'm going to teach you about inequity. Anybody that lives in L17 is invited around to a 3-course dinner and nobody else is. Fantastic maneuver. They were blogging about it, that it should be as an imperialist sort of stance and that people should boycott the dinner. I don't think they ever did, really. I mean, they have been going on for some time. That's always a pleasure. So I wanted to talk a little bit before I finish about the personal experience with COVID. As David says, I suddenly, I didn't think I was going to be unwell with COVID. I got very unwell, and then the symptoms persisted, and it was very weird experience. And I wrote about it in the British Medical Journal, and it was at a time when people were just recognizing this post-viral syndrome. And a lot of people were feeling this and thought they were going mad. So it was, up until that point, I'd really sort of, despite what David was saying, in the reviews, I tend to try and stay in the background. But here, it was necessary to use the platform of my established position to talk about this. And then I recovered by using ways to rethink how I interpret the symptoms. Very unusual illness, and using gradually sort of starting to increase my activity again. And where's Helen? Helen, we went through all this together, didn't we? And so that's fine when you're sick. You get on all the newspapers talking about sickness, and then when you recover, everybody drops you. And as a result of recovering the long COVID, doctors attacked me because they said I was saying it's all in the mind, and I wasn't. I was saying you can use the way you think about things to tackle the symptoms. And there's been credible death threats to me. It's just, and I thank the school for their support during these times. Although, yes, I mean, Jeremy saying, well, Paul, I wouldn't worry about that picture of a machine gun that's been sent to you because they haven't got a magazine in, and anyway, the bullets are very expensive in this country. That's Jeremy, right? Yes, that was very reassuring. And of course, that my friend in Allerton Road asked me the other day about whether she's a butcher, and she said, "Have you had any more of those death threats?" We were talking about this the other day. I said, "No." She said, "If they come back again, tell them there's a hormonal butcher ready to attack them." So it's great, really good support from people, and I thank the institution for that. But it is another form of bullying. So in summary, we need to make sure professionals and the public realize the value in unconflicted evidence. Cochrane's mission of a single high quality review, updated periodically, remains core to science and decision making, must be kept going. Bullying in science has become normalized, and particularly during COVID, we must address this, and institutional responses need to help people that are in this position, and it needs unpacking. So David has kindly offered, has thanked the staff that I've worked with for 25 years. So the four of us have 100 years of working together. They do need a medal for managing through that. And actually, they've not just been administrators. Paula showed the lack of women editors in Cochrane in 2000, that 11 out of 45 groups had no women. And Paula, Christiane, and Phil helped us do the first carbon accounting in the school, showing we were in our group burning up 59% of our carbon in air flights, and we took moves to try and not stop people traveling, but try and economize on that. And just to say, the work continues. So the malaria treatment guidelines, Tilly was here for 3 weeks and did a systematic review on pyronidine artemisinin safety that you presented at the meeting. Rebecca presented yesterday at the can you catch echinococcus from cows? Okay. Melissa did this great review looking at evidence synthesizing qualitative research with this very clear in things to do with mass drug administration for filariasis. It's rather like the deworming. So, and she showed that people in villages, and she used about 15 studies published, and she did a very nice job. So people understood the benefits and harms of drug treatments that, for this condition, that they had traditional narratives in their villages, but there was, and the status of the distributor was important. There were political influences over whether programs worked, and underneath it, very strong beliefs around colonialism and perception that international organizations were imposing on them. And I really believe this kind of research is very important for us to understand programs in this day and age and what we're trying to do. So Anne-Marie, I've just mentioned, was and Dee have been editors with the group, and Victoria's been with us for 25 years maybe, who's a trial search coordinator in Glasgow, 195 completed reviews, 13 in the editorial process, 17 published in the last year, and the impact figures jumped to 34, which is pretty good for our journal. So, and then Marty is our statistician, been with us with a great review team. I think, Catherine, what's this review called? I can never remember the name. PBO review, right? Okay, so that's a review, and people that have worked with us in the school has been great. This is the team. Thanks to Ian for kicking all this off, and thanks to you all for coming.
Photo time. Everyone smile.
Okay, thank you, please.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to do a selfie, Paul?
No, please go ahead.
We are going to do questions and answers, Paul.
Okay.
Or you don't do a selfie?
No, just keep.
No, everyone selfie now. Everyone smile again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our first question. Oh, sorry.
Ian. We just wanted to acknowledge that you were here, sir. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for coming in. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Are you ready, Paul?
Yeah.
So we're going to do online questions first, and then if anyone has a question in the room, we'll come over to you with a microphone. So first question, Paul, from lovely Trudy Harpham. If you were starting out again and could give your younger self some career advice, what would it be? And it better be good.
I probably would have started sort of aggressive sports a little bit earlier. Because actually British military fitness, or being military fit, was incredibly helpful when I was going through these. It's quite stressful sometimes when you're trying to tackle some of these issues. So I found that community very helpful. I would say also just follow your heart, be bold, and be kind to people. Well, kind to some people.
Okay, our next, we've got two questions from Hannah Ryan.
Oh yes, well, Hannah, you've seen.
Yes, Hannah has said, Paul, words can't express the gratitude that I have for the Cochrane Infectious Diseases group, and you in particular. I just wouldn't be where I am now without you. I have two very easy questions for you. One, what is the next great scandal coming down the road, in your esteemed opinion?
I think one of the biggest issues at the moment is what long COVID is throwing up in post-viral fatigue syndromes and issues around how the brain and the body interact, and trying to come out with something that helps patients realize that there are paths to recovery with some of these syndromes. I appreciate people with some of these chronic fatigue syndromes, Emmy, are very unwell, and that people with long COVID are very unwell, but there are ways out, and it's about being a little bit more open to alternative models around healthcare. There's a great paper by Engel in Science in about 1973 that talks about the dogma of medicine, and medicine does work for many things, but there are bits of medicine, including psychiatry and other areas, that we need to think in different ways.
Hannah's second question. Are you hopeful for the future of evidence-based medicine?
I think we've established methods, and I think it's important that people understand the methods and how those methods can be perverted and twisted. So I think the methods are there, but I still think we need careful attention to it, because people will then start to move evidence around, and you have to stick to your principles. And the important thing about evidence-based approaches is the involvement of people like Paula Williamson and Marty. Methodologists are core to this, and the content is also important. We got it slightly wrong early on in Cochrane with not engaging sufficiently sometimes on content, but I feel very optimistic. We've moved a long way.
I can't argue with that, Paul. Does anyone here have a question for Paul? Right behind you, so you're not scared.
Thank you. So, Paul, I was at a meeting this afternoon with somebody that you taught on the MSc at the London School They said, I think it was about 1832, but they said you were absolutely inspirational as a lecturer there on that MSc. That person was Harry Hemingway. And I'd like to know, what would you tell all of us who are teaching MSc students now? You know, how do we be an inspirational lecturer as you were? What was your secret?
Tell stories. We should tell stories. Yeah. Food. Tell stories. Tell stories and humour. You know, and take the diploma in tropical medicine and hygiene, a very important course in LSTM. Very students go on to great things. John Middleton, you did the DTMH some years ago and became chair of the Faculty of Public Health Medicine, right? I mean, DTMH students go on to do great things. And if they're on a 3-month course, you don't pack it with facts. You get them engaged in the topic. You get them interested in the topic. That's all you want. You want people to understand and engage in the topic. And stories really help, because the stories lodge it in people's brains with examples all the time and personal experience. And, you know, sort of perhaps being a bit vulnerable sometimes in front of them or whatever else, or being open, I think is important, not being standoffish and senior. That was off the top of my head.
Anyone else with a question? Yeah.
So, Paul, the great question of our time then. So you of all people, David Spiegelhalter says, data and evidence don't speak for themselves, do they? So you of all people should know something about that. So how do we make sure that the quality of evidence that we generate within Cochrane, how do we make sure that actually gets translated into policy, and how do we avoid it being subverted by some of the special interests that you've spoken about?
Well, I mean, you can't control everything really, but you can influence processes and influence guidelines processes and influence methods. And I mean, I think it's a mistake to become an advocate for promoting an intervention. I think it's okay to keep asking the questions if it challenges the status quo. But you got to put it out there, and you got to teach people about using it and understanding it and appraising it and its value in the system. It's never been a sort of a top-down approach that this tells people what to do. It simply presents the evidence in as unbiased and unconflicted way as possible, and that we just need to strive to keep that going. It's becoming increasingly difficult in the fragmented society that we got, where rules are getting broken all the time, including and politics kind of interfere with some of those rules. But we were talking about that today with the cystic echinococcus. You just stay on message, keep methodologists involved, keep disseminating it, do what you can.
Any more questions? There are a few more online, Paul. I don't know what the timing is like. Should I continue?
Have a couple and then
have
we'll
a couple?
Go, we'll
okay.
Get going.
We'll get going. I don't want to fatigue you. No. Okay, so we've got a question from Simon Lewin.
Oh, yeah.
He says he really enjoyed your lecture. Thank you so much for your incredible contributions. And it's been great to see the Cochrane Infectious Diseases Group doing qualitative evidence syntheses. Excellent. How do you think we might increase awareness of this approach among systematic reviewers and policy users?
Where you get PhD students like Melissa asking, Melissa Taylor, who's doing a PhD, looking at how qualitative research can be used more openly in guideline development. But I think the problem with qualitative research is that it's kind of being tacked on to a basically quantitative system, a medical system within WHO. And actually qualitative questions then sort of start you raising questions about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And it needs a bit more of a revolution in some of the decision making. You know, and Melissa's review really just shows the problems on the ground with top-down decisions made in New York or Washington or Geneva then being pushed out in the field because people think it's the right thing to do. And it doesn't always resonate with communities, and we need to understand that. So in terms of students and here and others, you know, looking at some of this qualitative evidence synthesis and seeing what it might open up, I think it's going to take some time, but important because it documents some of the politics.
Another one?
Okay.
Okay. You can say no.
No,
Yeah,
go.
this is your night, Paul. So we've got one from Dirk Muller. He says, how did you identify the very critical topics that you have time after time, from the worms, chloroquine for COVID, ivermectin? For the future, what do we need to look out for so we don't miss these scandals and misinformation?
So thanks, Dirk.
Thanks, Dirk.
Thanks, Dirk. Yeah. Thanks for all the money, by the way. He's our funder. I think asking a good question is an important skill that needs honing over time, and it's about looking and sniffing out areas of uncertainty. And you know, people talk about priority setting and they have great big long checklists to work out priorities, but it is about having a nose for where there might be something not quite right, or that there might be going on. It's just as we've been seeing in Echinococcus today. There are problems there, so it's following that through and following your nose. And I think good researchers, it's not a button you press and ask a good question. George, I mean, what do you think about how do you help people ask good research questions? Because you're constant, you ask about 20 research questions a day. How do you think you get it across to people?
Yeah, but 19 out of those 20 are hopeless, you see.
Okay.
Only one of them
yeah.
makes the cutoff. Well, I don't think you can get people to ask good research questions by talking about a very particular area of research that you're passionate about, unless, well, you talk about it and how you approach that issue, because you only develop good research questions about things you're passionate about.
Yeah.
So it's and things that you want to get answers to.
Yeah.
And I think you say that in most situations the best way to get reliable answers isn't to carry on applying exactly the same methods again and again. It's to think how you can develop methods. Every method can be biased. You know, randomized trials can get wrong answers. But you think of how you can bring together a series of different methods, all of which could be biased, but they're biased in different ways. Ultimately, you ultimately aim for biases that are literally orthogonal. So the factors which would bias one form of research would have no effect on biasing the other form of research. So an example of orthogonal bias would be using genetic variants related to LDL cholesterol to say whether LDL cholesterol causes heart attacks. That all could be biased, pleiotropy, etc., or randomized trials. You know, the two cannot be both. The probability of them both being biased and being biased in the same way when the biases are independent is small. So you get as many methods as you can in more difficult questions. You get as many methods as you can to address a question, and not just trust your favorite approach. You've got to learn about other approaches. Caroline's just kicked me to shut up.
Okay.
Because everyone wants wine, Paul. You've got to realize.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it's to challenge authority. That is a good way of starting. You can get good research questions by challenging authority and saying, is this right? Should we be doing this? And that's the way forward. That's it, folks.
That sums you up, Paul. Thank you. Yeah. You did it.